All right, let's get into this last chapter on sex and gender. Usually the terms sex and gender are often used interchangeably, but sociologists differentiate between the two. For instance, on a job application, you might see a checkbox that says select your gender, male or female. This is an inappropriate use of the term gender. The application is actually referring to the term sex. So when we think about sex, what we're talking about is what we refer to as an individual's membership of one of two biologically distinct categories, male or female. Now, there is a third category, a hermaphrodite, someone that shares characteristics of both, but for the most part, we're looking at males and females. Primary sex characteristics determine the differences between these two. Biological factors, chromosomes, hormones, reproductive organs, and then secondary characteristics give us cues of who they are, like differences between physical differences between males and females, facial hair, body hair, muscular and bone structure. These things aren't related to reproduction, but they give us cues to what sex the individual is. When we think about this, of course, we're talking about, in reference to chromosomes, the XX. Male is the XY. Dominant hormone for females, estrogen. For males, testosterone. Of course, reproductive organs like the vagina, the cervix, the uterus, ovaries, fallopian tubes for females. And then, of course, penis, testicles, scrotum, prostate, and other glands for males. This is how we know the differences between us in reference to sex. That's biological. Gender, on the other hand, is not biological. It's learned behavior. And it refers to the physical, behavioral, and personality traits that a group considers normal for males and females. Gender identity refers to an individual's self-definition or sense of gender, while gender expression refers to an individual's behavioral manifestations of their gender. So instead of thinking about gender as a dichotomy, we are now beginning to think of gender as a continuum. Some essentials when we think about gender. Essentialists see gender as biological or genetic and believe that gender is a simple two-category binary system. It's determined by our chromosomes, hormones, and genitalia, and it's permanent and unchanging. Essentialists are generally not sociologists. They are often in the fields such as medicine, theology, and biology. And although sometimes there are some sociologists that buy into this, like the sociobiologists, most of the sociology field is seeing gender as a learned behavior. Most sociologists, in reference to that, are seen as constructionists, where they approach and see sex, gender, and sexuality as social constructs, i.e., social constructions. These constructionists believe that gender is constructed or created through our interactions with other members of society. In the United States, we tend to classify people as being male or female, but other societies have different classification systems. For instance, queer theorists emphasize the importance of differences and reject ideas of innate identities or restrictive categories of gender and sexual identity. This brings us to sexuality and sexual orientation. Although some evidence supports a biological component of sexual orientation, Research is in this area still in a preliminary phase. Many have embraced the idea that sexual orientation is genetic, based on the idea that if sexuality is innate, then sexuality-based discrimination is unacceptable. While most Americans oppose gay marriage, many say they would support civil unions. Sexual orientation is not based on gender. It is the inclination to be heterosexual or attracted to the opposite sex, homosexual or attracted to the same sex, or bisexual, attracted to either sex. Those who are asexual may simply reject any sexual identity at all. You might find yourself asking, is sexual orientation a continuum rather than a simple set of categories? And Alfred Kinsey suggested that human sexuality was far more diverse than was commonly assumed. His own studies led him to believe that people were not exclusively heterosexual or homosexual, but could fall on a wide spectrum. The Kinsey scale of sexuality is an example of queering the binary, as it rejects binary and heteronormative categories of sexuality. And you can see it goes from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, but there are variations between those two extremes. So we have to think about inequality when we think about sex, gender, and sexuality as well. In a society that's based on dominant-minority relationships, you can always assume that sex and gender and sexuality are going to be used to discriminate against certain unfavorable categories within society. Despite a great deal of change in recent years, homophobia is still common in American society. Some argue that the term homophobia represents a biased attitude because the term phobia implies a psychological condition, thus excusing intolerance. So we really need to examine how we see the other in reference to their sex, gender, and sexuality. Misogyny, of course, is an ingrained prejudice against women based on a dislike or contempt or possibly even a hatred of women. It leads to sexism, gender inequality, and homophobia, all of which can be found in past and present societies. The functionalists, of course, tend to believe that society functions the way it does as a result of men and women having different roles and tasks. Functionalists would likely agree that sometimes these differences result in inequalities, but that there's a purpose for this in the society overall. Talcott Parsons, who was a prominent functionalist in the mid 1900s, he felt that while it may be true that men and women have traditionally filled these gender-specific roles, many contemporary theories were arguing that this is a result of our socialization, i.e. the way we've been taught to behave. Parsons believed that men are more suited for an instrumental role, the person who provides the family's material support and is often an authority figure, whereas women were more suited for an expressive role, the person who provides the family's emotional support and nurturing. These beliefs were ingrained in the American construction of gender as a male-dominated, female-dominated, or male-dominant, female-dominated dichotomy, and began to be argued as an essentialist would, that These were not necessarily learned behaviors, but were part of our genetic makeup. Conflict theorists, of course, they have something to say here. The conflict theorists point out that men stand to lose a great deal if gender inequality disappears. For example, they would have to do more unpaid work, or pay to have their homes kept up and children cared for. Conflict theorists are interested in the imbalance of power in society and the struggles that people go through trying to gain access to power which they've traditionally not had access to. In many societies, it's clear that women have not had access to power, and oftentimes still do not have access to power. Gender inequality can be found in all past and present societies, and it invariably takes the form of patriarchy or male domination. The interactionists, of course, have something to say here as well. This theory maintains that gender is shaped through our culture and our interaction with others. The idea that gender is reproduced means that adults have learned their gender roles and that they teach those roles to their children, and that then people reinforce those gender norms, thus perpetuating them or reproducing them throughout the time passage within a given society. And then, of course, we have feminist theories. We're really getting into I don't want to say a subset of conflict theories, but the feminist theories apply assumptions about gender inequalities to social institutions to illuminate how gender inequality affects all areas of social life. But in many respects, they run hand in hand with the conflict theorists. This is a chart, an important chart if you want to understand the differences between the perspectives in respect to their approach to gender inequality, and then they give case studies where male and female dominated occupations play a part. So take a look at it. We've talked about reproduction. That brings us into the realm of socialization. And socialization plays an important part in gender and sexuality. Gender role socialization is the lifelong process of learning to be masculine or feminine, primarily through four main agents of socialization: the family, the school, their peers, and the media. So, ask yourself, can you identify specific examples of gender socialization in your life? For instance, were you ever told that a specific behavior wasn't appropriate because that you were a boy or a girl? Did you ever receive a harsher or more lenient punishment because you were a boy or a girl? These are things to think about when you think about the socialization process and why certain groups of people are allowed to do things that other groups of people aren't. When we think about socialization, there are four categories, the first being the family. These are usually the primary source of socialization and greatly impact gender role socialization early in life. Social learning theory suggests that babies and children learn behaviors and meanings through social interaction and internalize the expectations of those around them. According to social learning theory, children tend to mimic significant role models in their lives. For instance, a boy sees his father working on the car. The boy looks up to his father and identifies with this father's biological sex. The boy learns indirectly through observation that it is a man's job to work on the car, and he internalizes that expectation for himself as well.